our technical expert and science-based problem solver. Thank you all for joining us today. So before we get too far, I want to make sure that we kind of level set things and start from the same place. So Steve, can you give us a quick PFAS 101?
Certainly. I'm just going to stand up. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. Just 2 slides, I promise here. But this will help, I think, with PFAS 101. PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And it's a mouthful, but basically what it is, it's a group of thousands of synthetic chemicals that have been developed and in widespread use for about 80 years now. And many products are produced by, with the use of PFAS, including things that you think of like every day, like Teflon and Gore-Tex and Scotchgard, things like that. And because they have, they're very resistant to staining, they're resistant to grease and water, and all that is because of the chemical characteristics down here, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But another thing that makes them unique is they are extremely recalcitrant, resistant to breakdown in the environment. And if you look at let's just get into chemistry a little bit. I'll keep it real big picture. But there are 2 primary components of a PFAS molecule. There's the hydrophobic tail, which is fluorinated carbon, and then the hydrophilic head. So hydrophobic is water-hating, hydrophilic is water-loving. And because of these carbon-fluorine bonds, which are some of the strongest covalent bond in nature, these compounds don't break down. They're very difficult to break them down. So they're very widespread in nature because they're produced widely and they don't break down. They don't break down well by the human body or just in nature in general. And so they're out there, they're everywhere, they're not breaking down, and they happen to be toxic to varying degrees. There are thousands of compounds that toxicologists are trying to get their arms around the toxicity. They generally don't agree between states and from country to country. There are different standards. You can imagine the challenge in trying to get your arms around it. So there are some PFAS limits in drinking water. During the Biden administration, there were a handful. Now it's sort of been pared back to a focus on a couple, PFAS and PFOA. That's the primary focus right now. So where do they originate? You might have heard of them in firefighting foams. Well, they're because of the hydrophobic tail and the hydrophilic head, they act like detergents or surfactants, so they foam really well. And if there's a fire or a spill of airplane fuel on the runway, the first thing you want to do is coat it with a foam that is very resistant to breakdown, right? So it'll prevent the fire by suffocating it. Oxygen can't in. If the fires can't get in, if the fire's already started, it will suffocate it with compounds that are very difficult to break down. So military bases, airports, fire training areas, there's been spills, and they've entered the groundwater. So that's one of the ways that they proliferate in the environment. Industrial production facilities that manufacture things that have PFAS in them or use PFAS to make products, electronics, chrome plating, paper. Some of the industries I'm getting involved in recently are pharmaceutical, where they're making GLP-1s, Wegovy, Zepbound, those types of things. Believe it or not, they use PFAS to manufacture those pharmaceuticals. Paper making as well. Consumer products, popcorn bags. Think about taking a bag that's coated in PFAS, putting it in a microwave at a high temperature, and then eating the popcorn. Doesn't sound like a great idea, right? Pizza boxes, things like that. Carpets, upholstery. Think about the Scotchgard, things that you try to resist staining, grease, those types of things. And then personal care products, believe it or not, shampoos, cosmetics, not so much anymore. But if you look at the photo down in the lower right, we just didn't know for a long time that these compounds were toxic. This is the firefighter and 4th of July spraying PFAS foam all over the kids, right? What could go wrong? And so now we know that these compounds are toxic. So where does all this stuff end up when you throw it away? All these various products in a landfill, right? And then before the landfill is capped, it rains. These PFAS leach down into the landfill leachate, sometimes into groundwater. They go to wastewater treatment plants when the leachate is discharged there, and then they proliferate into the environment through biosolids and agricultural feedstocks and those types of things. So I will hand it back to Sky.
Thank you, Steve. So now that we have a little bit of a baseline, let's bring this into our world. Because PFAS doesn't just show up in other industries, it shows up in our ecosystem as it is today. And ultimately, it needs to shape the decisions that we're making, both currently and how we move into the future. So let's just ground this in reality instead of noise. Where are we actually seeing PFAS show up in the biogas ecosystem today, and where are we not? Megan, I think you can start, and then I think, Steve, you have some pretty good input on this as well.
Well, now I'm already concerned because I didn't know half of the stuff that it was in. I learned a lot today already. But as far as like my expertise is mainly the landfill gas space, and it is obviously very prevalent there. Everything ends up in a landfill at some point. Like you said, water gets in the landfill, you have your leachate, but you outsource all of that gas, right? Like, so you're sending it to either get burned or refined and sent into the pipeline. So pretty much anything it touches has PFAS. All your filtration, all of your media, it gets deposited. Your condensate that drops out of your gas has it. So it continues the process, and we don't know how much ends up in our pipeline, but there's definitely some in there. And I know we were talking about earlier the fact that now people are trying to figure out how to deal with that as well. So anything and everything that it touches, pretty much in any sort of landfill gas facility, is going to have PFAS.
And Steve, do you want to touch a little bit on like the wastewater and biosolids side of things?
Sure, yes. So it's interesting. If you think about a wastewater treatment plant, it's accepting industrial wastewaters that might be pre-treated or might not. They often have PFAS in there. Municipal wastewater from all the personal care products, et cetera, have PFAS. Landfill leachate often ends up at the wastewater. So all these sources of PFAS end up at the wastewater treatment plant. A lot of the PFAS passes through untreated. Some of it ends up in biosolids, which might be applied as fertilizer, or they might go into a digester, right? And so the biosolids will go into let's say they go to the digester. Some of the PFAS end up in the landfill gas. Some of the PFAS end up in the digestate, which then gets spread sometimes, often, as fertilizer, right? And then for agricultural feedstock, and then the animals eat that feedstock, so now they're contaminated with PFAS. The manure may go to a digester, and the cycle sort of repeats itself. And then some of the more volatile PFAS compounds end up in the gas, right? So you have like the fluorotellular alcohols, and then when the landfill gas condenses, you have condensate, which tends to have fluorotellular carboxylates from the anaerobic degradation of some of these PFAS intermediates. So it's quite a cycle from the wastewater, the various sources coming into the treatment plant to right on through to the biogas and the digestate.
So when I was a developer in Maine, it was right when Maine was passing a bunch of policy around PFAS because a bunch of milk had tested positive. And I think, as you think about developing projects and how you're integrating farms' resources together, there needs to be a lot of trust that we as an industry aren't doing anything to hurt the integrity of what the farm is going to put into their ecosystem long term. So I think the one thing we really haven't touched on is there's a lot of interest in this, in the fertilizer, using digestate as fertilizer. And from a traditional non-PFAS related dairy project, so like the one that I developed, if we were to introduce post-consumer food waste, which typically comes with a lot of the paperboard backing to all of that food, having something like a really effective depack facility is going to be critical to not unintentionally introduce PFAS into that farm's ecosystem. And Steve, I mean, are there other food waste types of resources that we should be concerned about, or at least aware of when we're thinking about feedstock?
Yeah, feedstock, there are all types of foods that have PFAS in them. And think about it, like how does PFAS get into animal feedstock? Well, it gets in through spreading digestate or otherwise treated biosolids onto farmers' fields, right? And then it gets into the groundwater. And then the groundwater is used to irrigate farmers' fields to grow fruits and vegetables. And so there are all sorts of ways that PFAS can enter, you know, food packaging, all kinds of ways that PFAS enter the food system, and then the food waste gets into the digester and the cycle can repeat itself.
So just kind of bringing this back to operational reality, what can you realistically test for and treat and manage today? I mean, it's an ongoing battle of standards. It seems to be an ever-moving target, but what are the most, you know, between air and solids and water, what are the most reliable treatment and testing resources today?
Well, if we start with testing, I'd say the most reliable analytical tests are for water, because we've been doing it the longest, and they also tend to be the least expensive because we've been testing those the longest. Solids, soils, and other solid wastes are coming along. Their extraction techniques, and we can measure the PFAS in those solids in milligrams per kilogram or micrograms per kilogram. Air and gas, vapor streams, are the farthest behind, but now we have developed, for example, OTM 45 and OTM 50, and those are now reliable ways of testing the PFAS content of gas streams, but they're expensive. They're typically in the $2,000 to $3,000 range per sample. And that will come down as it becomes more common, but it just hasn't been that common to test PFAS in air, gas, or vapor samples to date.
So I think a burning question for me would be, so say you do unintentionally introduce PFAS into your digester. Is there a way to still capture the nutrients from the effluent by still pulling out the PFAS? Like, can you maintain that nutrient value?
There are three ways, and they're not that fully developed. The first one is, one way is you can go upstream and you identify what are the streams coming into let's say it's wastewater sludge that's going to the digester, right? You can go upstream and treat those like landfill leachate, and that's happening a lot now. The Waste Managements and Waste Connections and Republic Services are now treating, a lot of them are treating their landfill leachate before it gets into the wastewater. You can also work at that wastewater treatment plant, right, to take some of the concentrated recycle streams, and we're developing chemical-based, like coagulation, flocculation, separation techniques to clean up those recycle streams. Sort of like, think of it as a kidney to pull PFAS out of the wastewater treatment plant. And our company right now, the third thing, we're working with the University of Queensland in Australia to develop a method of actually extracting PFAS from biosolids, liquid biosolids, before they go into the digester. And then, so that keeps the PFAS out of the digester, and then, you know, out of the digestate, which then becomes fertilizer and contaminates the manure, which sometimes end up in digesters. So those are the three main techniques.
So John, let me pick on you for a little bit. Right when you're about to take a drink of water. If a facility was compliant and they, you know, well, say they were compliant at a time and then the rules changed because our standards continue to change. Can past actions be evaluated under new standards?
They can, sure. I mean, this goes to, it's a compliance question as well, but you know, it also touches on legal issues like litigation, so I'll give a two-part answer here. You know, regulations do change, and what I've seen in my practice, and I should say I represent companies, I'm not a plaintiff's attorney, But what I've seen, in the New England area where I practice and in other states across the country is that certainly with PFAS, these regulations have changed, right, fairly rapidly in the most recent years. But, just because a company or an industry or whatever it may be was compliant years ago does not absolve them of liability for the shifting regulations that emerge. There are countless examples in my practice and other law firms of companies that did just that. They were compliant. Then PFAS regulations came along. They may have been compliant with those when they first came out, but then they evolved, they became more stringent, and there was a lack of compliance because they couldn't act quick enough, perhaps, let's say. It's not an absolute that you were compliant, absolute defense that you were compliant in the past and you're not now. You can absolutely still be on the hook for those issues. And, litigation-wise, all of us are citizens and individuals. If we wanted to join a class action lawsuit or sue some sort of corporate entity for putting PFAS into our environment or drinking water, none of that compliance is an absolute defense whatsoever. And I know that the topic here is not to panic, but I'm just telling you, it's reality though, because from a litigation perspective, past good behavior is like a trial theme. It's nice to talk about, to show a jury, but from a liability standpoint, it is not an absolute defense. So that's my brief answer.
So what would that mean and how you would have operators document, test, or make decisions today?
Yeah, this is a question I get all the time. Should I test? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I give a two-part question back. What are you testing for? And what are you going to do with the results once you test? Okay? So, the first part is not my expertise. What are you testing for? If you listen to the EPA, there are 15,000 PFAS. What are you testing for? Are you testing for just fluorine? You're testing for PFAS? Whatever. But for me, from a risk legal kind of perspective, the second question is really the most important one. What are you going to do with the information once you have it? Are you just going to put it in a file and then hope if like the EPA or a state regulatory body comes knocking that you can show them, oh look, we did testing. That's lovely, but 9 times out of 10, if they're coming after you, they're going to be coming after you saying, well, what did you do with that? Part of the diligence process is test and then react. And then in the litigation context, which is also incredibly important and risk heavy, the testing actually shows, well, now you had actual knowledge that you have a PFAS problem. And then, if you find your way into civil litigation, the question becomes, the plaintiffs will say, what did you do with that knowledge? And if the answer is, I didn't do much, I put it in the file, you've got a problem, because then you had a duty to do something in the civil litigation context, and you may not have. And even if you did, the question is, did you do enough? These are questions that have no one singular answer for any industry, and that's why it's really just a company by company, client by client answer that you really have to navigate, but they're very important questions.
I really want to focus on, really started to dive into the fertilizer side of things. Megan?
Okay, so I completely agree on some aspects.
Awesome.
The only thing I would say is, if there is no obligation right now to clean up PFAS, let's say you do soil and water sampling, get a baseline. Because now that they've passed some of these laws, if you have a spill and there's PFAS, you may be required to clean it up. If you have no idea what happened at that site or what your baseline number is, you're on the hook for whatever happened there for the last 80 years since they created it? So you could end up cleaning up a whole bunch of stuff that's not yours.
And you will.
And you will.
You will.
But at least you would have a baseline to go off of. That being said, I was thinking about what you were talking about, and not only is it the biosolids going out in the environment, but we burn the landfill gas. We're not burning it at high enough temperature to actually break down the PFAS. So all of those exhausts are going up in the air and falling down all over the place. So we have no idea. It's everywhere.
Well, it's interesting from a legal perspective. You all are the technical and compliance experts for sure. And I think, Steve, you mentioned, PFAS has evolved because we first looked at water, then solids, and now we're looking more closely at gas. it's interesting that the litigation has done the exact same thing as well as the regulatory side of things. And to your example about gas and industry and industries I talk to, especially in like waste management, often say, I'm not so worried about that right now. Help me with water and solids. And I say, well, hold on. You shouldn't just forget about that. To the theme again, you don't need to panic, but you do need to come up with a plan. You need to think about that. And I'll use a real life example here in Connecticut. Again, I'm in the New England area. There was a lawsuit from a facility where they got sued by a class action group of citizens for air emissions from their, it was like a paper related industry. They were emitting air emissions, but they also had a sludge treatment pool on their land and on their site, and so they had a digester on the site, but they were also had like a off-gassing type of technology for some reason. I think they were trying to treat it in some way or manage those that off-gassing, but they got sued because of the air emissions and that off-gassing carrying PFAS to, I think it was a 10-mile radius in Connecticut of surrounding citizens who said that was polluting our drinking water. So that's ongoing, and they're navigating that. But there is certainly some risk, exactly to your point.
Yeah.
I actually want to shift gears a little bit. I was going to dive into fertilizer, but I think it's actually more important that we talk about this. I want to talk about policy and practical action, because we need to get back to this room and figure out what is it that you guys need to actually do, because we're already seeing precedent being set in adjacent industries, and we just need to be prepared for how we react next. So I guess my question, and feel free for anyone to jump in on this, but like, what are the nuances in the relaxed federal posture around PFAS? Like, how does that matter? Because from what I'm seeing, it's propelling states into faster regulatory action. And I'd like to get your take on why that's so critically important to this room and why it's important for their projects. John,
Okay.
we just go right down the line.
You
Or
can go
wanna jump
first.
in?
I'll let you all start, actually.
So my concern is that most of the loudest people in the room around PFAS are not the people that actually understand PFAS. So states, obviously, US EPA has a lot more resources and a lot more people that actually have a deep knowledge of some of these subject matters. States, on the other hand, it's going to be whoever's raising their hand and annoying enough people to get them to do something. So if the industry is not in the room, they can't explain how all of these things that they're proposing will actually impact operations, cost, potentially making beneficial use of gas non-viable. It's just, you need to be there, because most of the time the people that are getting the most traction are not the ones that actually understand it.
I'm interested in your take, John, on that.
No, I actually agree with I agree with what you said, Megan. I think it's an excellent point. All of you are probably in different industry fields, different groups. You probably have trade associations that you may join or work with. In the US, and what I see, but it's really isolated most of the times at the federal level, is those associations trying to have the voice there. But to Megan's point, the EPA already has much more resources than states. So what we see is a lot of very reactionary things at state levels that do not at all incorporate corporate interests or industry interests whatsoever. And it's very difficult, because then all the corporations and industries are trying to catch up. I think from my practice and what I've seen with my clients is that the EU is actually much better about this than the US. The EU is willing and has a lot of open forums to for industries to speak to them and help them explain the economic impact that this will have. And it's really shaping and slowing down, I would say, how aggressively the EU is initially wanting to move forward on PFAS. And I think in the US, unfortunately at the state level, to your point, Megan, that is just not the case.
Perfect. You nailed it. Yeah.
I think the other side of the coin too is that when states are making these decisions, because they're making them largely in a vacuum without all the details that they need to know, there are so many unintended consequences that end up occurring. Like in our state in Maine, they thought they could ban biosolids spreading on fields. And so they thought, okay, great, we'll send them to landfill. So they did. But the landfill, they also simultaneously passed a ban on out-of-state C&D waste, which is the primary bulking agent for biosolids. So then there became a huge issue with landfills not even be able to take the biosolids because they couldn't source enough material to bulk and put them into the landfill safely. So from there, we ended up with, I don't know the exact term, but I'm just going to say dumpsters full of biosolids sitting on city streets that wouldn't be picked up because there was no place to put them. Those are the types of unintended consequences that can happen when decisions are made in a vacuum, and that's why it's so critically important that this industry is involved, right? You're involved in the states where you have your projects. I want to open it up now because we've covered a lot of ground, but many of the best questions are going to come from you and what you're seeing in your own projects. So I'd love to start taking some questions. Just step up to the mic. Don't be shy. I can see a lot of people who have burning questions.
Hey, my name is, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, my name's Drew Whitlock. I'm with Kroll Engineers. I'll be speaking this afternoon on the municipal market. And at one point I wanted to make, and I have a question for John, is that on the municipal side, with 503 regs, some of the state bans, some of the state promulgation on this is going to be telling about how things evolve at the federal level. Our understanding is at the federal level there is going to be some guidance that comes up with sort of a Michigan model, which is a tiered approach to PFAS management, and it's probably a good thing, and it's more about source control. So I think that's kind of where the leading edge of the regulatory aspects are, and there's a lot to, for this group to learn from that. I think that's really where it's at. So, but John, back to your point about the testing. I guess I'm an engineer, not a lawyer, but I think about plausible deniability, right?
Sure.
And so, is it plausible, given the state of where PFAS is and the understanding and so forth, is it really an appropriate defense that you can say, I haven't tested it, so we don't know, at this point? If you and there may be certain cases where that's actually happening, but if you have if you know PFAS is in there, it's probably, it seems to me that, to Megan's point, you probably need to be testing it to understand where you are.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. And I think there are, to the point, there are many of my clients who say, why should I just not test and avoid this entire issue? Plausible deniability is one term. The opposite phrase applicable here is, sticking your head in the sand and hoping the issue goes away. And the sticking your head in the sand approach from a legal perspective never works. It just does not. I'm being very candid about that, especially in litigation, because you have to understand in a litigation context, and also if the federal government comes after you from an enforcement perspective or a state comes after you, the question is not, well, what did you know and what did you do? It's what should you have been doing? We're here at this massive conference presenting on PFAS. I've been talking at PFAS conferences for 7 years now. There are hundreds of these things. There's literature coming out every day, every week. You can't just, as a company or an entity, say, well, we didn't see any of that, we didn't know about it, we stuck our head in the sand. It looks bad. It looks bad. So that's why I say it's always a discussion with my clients. Not just what do you know, what have you tested for, but here's what you as an industry and what your competitors are doing. You need to think about this. So.
And we do have clients that spend a lot of money treating PFAS that don't even have regulations. Ultra short chains, for example, and the idea being that we know that there's toxicity associated with them, and just because there's a regulation, right? You look at some of the big companies that that produced a lot of PFAS. There were no regulations. In fact, it was long before regulations. But there were emails and whatnot that people knew, right? And that's the whole, that can come back to bite you. So a lot of companies are getting ahead of that, even though they're not regulations. And I think that's smart.
Megan, I'm actually curious because I work with folks like you oftentimes in that dynamic. What do you think about the whole testing question to the question?
It is a challenge. It's a challenge to decide how you're going to approach it, because to a certain extent, I am almost always if it's not legally required, we shouldn't be doing it. On the other hand, there is that risk piece where, in my opinion, especially if you're going to be developing a site and or you're already operating it, at least knowing soil and groundwater concentrations is actually a positive. You're not required to clean it up right now. But if you don't know what's there, then when all of these things come into play later, you have no ability to go back and say, okay, this is what we contributed to the concentration. Here's what was already here, and be able to prove that you only need to be treating to a certain, you may treat well beyond that, but that you can say, we know what we contributed here starting on X date that you take those samples. So just reducing your risk long term, because everything's got PFAS. I can guarantee you take a soil sample anywhere and there's PFAS in it. It's just to what concentration.
Right.
Yeah.
Hi, Bennett Rubin, Ohio Lumex. We're gas analysis people, specialists in RNG, and I can tell you I deal with all the RNG producers, pipelines, utilities. Nobody wants to test gas for PFAS. I talk to them all the time about this. We could develop a method to do this, but there's no demand, and nobody wants to know. And OTM 50 is very limited in what it can do, and I'm just telling you reality.
Yeah,
And,
can I take that for a second? There are interconnect agreements right now that are leaving space in there to be able to put in limits around the PFAS in the gas.
There's no baseline. People don't know what is safe and what's not safe. What is the baseline?
There's no standard right now.
There's no
right?
standard right now, but it's coming, because when PFAS enters the pipeline and goes to a consumer's home, the burner tip at their house is not hot enough to destroy it.
Correct.
And that's why the language is there. So I think that demand is going to come. So if it's something that you're interested in developing for this industry, you might have a really hot product pretty soon.
I keep telling everybody it's coming.
It
But
is.
right now, every interconnection agreement has a paragraph anyway that says anything you introduce to the pipeline that causes damage, it's your fault anyway. So technically, it's already covered. But having a specification is what people are looking for.
Yeah, I mean that's the piece. The pipeline agreements that we have seen have the call out, so all they need to do is plug and play as soon as they have actual limits. So that's the new one that we're seeing.
So one thing with that though, natural gas also has PFAS in it. Compressor oil, everything else contributes to it, so they need to be testing their gas too.
Well,
not just the one.
Yeah, isn't that the pot calling the kettle black?
A little bit.
I'm sure there are more questions here. Perfect.
Yeah, hi, Steve Innes with NGH Consultants. Have there been tests of pipeline gas and found PFAS, like actually in pipeline gas?
Yes.
And is it coming from like farms and things? Because I mean, you're sending it through all these treatment processes.
So it's throughout the refining process. It is introduced in certain places based on whatever the materials are. So it's not every single natural gas sample is going to have it, but they have testing data that has shown before anything else is introduced that the gas itself has had PFAS somehow added to it. It can be compressor oil, it can be the materials for the pipeline, whatever it is. So yeah, it's challenging, let's say, to figure out where it's coming in, but it is. Not at high concentrations, but it's there.
And from an RNG perspective, Ontaris and Stark has done some work together to analyze at least our treatment process. And from the work that we've done, we've determined that the actual gas cleaning process, as it's outlined by us, does a pretty good job at removing PFAS from the gas itself. And Ontaris has a pretty reasonable assumption that there would need to be maybe a polishing vessel based on the actual spec that's set by any given state or pipeline.
So yeah, it's pretty good now, could be improved.
Right.
And one of the challenges is when you go through the membrane separation of the methane from the carbon dioxide, the PFAS do tend to partition with the methane. So you want to get it out upstream before that step.
I'd also like to ask about like food waste digesters and what to do with the digestate. I know in Michigan it's been a huge problem, just not with PFAS, but now this PFAS is an additional issue. Can you speak to that?
To what to do with the digestate in general, like across the board?
Well, no, the PFAS that's, you know, in food waste now is in the digestate, and what to do with
Oh,
that.
I mean, there are plenty of treatment technologies. I mean, Steve, you could talk, it's all going to be based on the flow of your project and your discharge goals. So Steve can walk you through, there's like a couple basic ones that are probably pretty applicable to this industry, and that might be helpful.
Yeah, so technologies for just removing PFAS. Yeah, I talked a little bit about granular activated carbon, and there are various synthetic medias, little plastic beads typically that are highly engineered. They could be sorptive media, they could be ion exchange, resin. There are different ways that we can modify biological treatment systems to remove PFAS. There are chemical ways, coagulation, flocculation, separation technologies that we can use. I talked a little bit about some PFAS extraction technologies, but one of the most exciting new treatment developments is in destruction of PFAS, both on the liquid and the solid side. Originally it was really difficult to do, it was very expensive to do, but some of these new technologies are coming out that can, using relatively low power and very low chemical use, can destroy the wide variety of PFAS compounds in various streams, whether they be gas, liquid, or solid. So there's a ton of research going on, a lot of it at the university level, some of it at the startup level, but we're making big progress because there's such a need.
I think we'll ping pong back and forth. Let's start with you.
Hi, I'm Lauren Ray, and I work with Cornell University in Extension with dairy farms. I have a lot of questions, but I guess I'll focus on two. One is that I am pursuing some opportunities working with professors at Cornell who understand PFAS and understand microplastics and some of the testing and things that are out there. I want to know what you think is most important for us to maybe help them, as far as how are we going to learn, what do we need to learn on farms with digesters and without? So I work mostly with dairy farms. Some take food waste, some don't. So that's the first question.
Do you want me to start or frame this a little
Go
bit?
ahead.
Yeah, okay. So dairy digester, I'm assuming you're at a farm that we'll just set a baseline. They've never introduced any sort of biosolids to their feed or their fields. It's not in their current ecosystem. They're thinking about doing something like adding food waste, either for the tipping revenue by bringing it in, or for the energy generation that it's going to create. What are the things that they need to think about before introducing food waste? Like we talked a lot about post-consumer food waste. Is it a testing on the front end? Should they do diligence before they introduce it? What are some best practices for them?
I think testing is a big step, yeah, just to make sure what you're accepting into that digester has a limited amount of PFAS, because once it's in there, we're not doing a great job right now removing PFAS from the digestate or the gas. We're removing it from the gas to some degree, but I think testing it and understanding what's coming in and then being selective is the best we can do at this point.
Yeah, I think the best thing to do is not take any new PFAS into your project. A big highlight. Do you have another question?
Yeah, and also getting a baseline, right, Megan? I mean, I am very curious about that because it is everywhere. So even on farm fields that have never done anything, it could be there, right?
Yep, exactly.
So the other thing that I hear a lot is, and I missed the beginning of this, but I guess just I always try to navigate the discussion. What I hear from people is they're saying, oh, you know, there's PFAS in everything, and they're kind of mixing it up with like plastics and microplastics. And I guess I'm wondering the best way to navigate that conversation, because I do feel like microplastics is important. Maybe it's easier to like measure and actually know what to do about, but they're not the same. You don't have one with the other exclusively, right? So
Yeah, I think that goes to, they're very similar in some ways because it's like they're everywhere. They're, you know, in our bodies, they're in the ocean, they're all over the place. So people really do end up kind of putting them together. But I agree with you that it's a very different problem. So you can't just lump them together and say, oh, well, food waste, it's gonna have PFAS, it's gonna have plastics and like that whole thing. You've gotta be able to kind of look at those very separately, but understand that your treatment may be similar for both. You know, you may use, you know, carbon media and filter the gas and it may pull everything out or some of it out. And so it may be in the long term a similar process, but yeah, they're not, they just get lumped together somehow. Like.
thank you.
Look over here.
Yeah. I have a lot of questions too, but I'll go to a study, John, or a case where in Johnson County, Texas, I don't know if you've been following this or not, the attorney's Beverage and Diamond and Centegro. Centegro's the defendant.
Yep.
Yeah, and so I don't know if anything like that is happening on the commercial side, but that is happening, and they've done a ton of research on this. The PFAS is not from the biocells. They've done parallel studies of that, and they've actually done source analyses, you know, to determine the type of PFAS that's coming from the biosolids and what's on the land. And it's interesting, you know, one of the things that they're looking at is the fracking water. May be high in PFAS, and of course there's a lot of fracking in Texas and so forth. They don't really know the source of the PFAS, but I'm curious what's happening on, you know, litigation on anything you can point to, similarities there.
Similarities to that specific lawsuit?
Yeah, are you seeing that on the commercial side? Or
Yeah.
is it CERCLA related? I mean, how are these things evolving?
I can get into the legal statutes if you want, but I think to start with, the first question, there are other lawsuits that are very similar. Not with companies that are necessarily as large and national presence as Sinagro, but there are. I mean, there's one in my home state of Massachusetts, for example, that deals with biosolids and an adjacent composting facility. The composting facility's been there for about 40 years at this point, operating, composting waste, food waste, yard waste, all of these other things, some manufacturing, industrial waste. And in the adjacent area, there's been a lot of farmland application of biosolids. So the largest class action PFAS lawsuit and the largest regulatory enforcement action in all of New England right now is this site in Massachusetts, which we are involved in, our law firm. So I can tell you, yes, for sure, there are other applications across the country where similar lawsuits like the Sinagro one are taking place and playing out.
Hi all, Tim Ollig from Planey T Biogas, and this might be a question for Steve. Coming back to that food waste kind of pre-treatment versus post-treatment or downstream treatment with the PFAS, do you think there's any emerging technology or any real practical solution for removing those PFAS-rich waste streams before the anaerobic digestion process, or is that something that's going to be way off in the future?
Yeah, I think it depends on the source of the waste coming into the digester. Food wastes are challenging, right? If it's biosolids coming into the digester or manure coming into the digester, you can kind of you can get upstream and attack the problem and treat the source. But food waste, you know, if you haven't controlled the PFAS content and what's being used to fertilize or the groundwater that's being used to irrigate, once PFAS are in the food, it's tough. It's just such a varied matrix, right? To treat, that's going to be a real challenge.
Thank you.
Follow up on that, Steve, is that on the municipal side, most of the focus for PFAS treatment has been, you know, source control, of course, you know, any treatment you can do up front that's feasible. There's on the water streams, there's stuff going on with already. So that's happening. But on the wastewater side of things, we're seeing a lot of thermal processing evolving on, so there's a dewater digestate that goes into that. Are you guys seeing the same thing? I mean, what we're seeing is fluidized bed incineration with RTOs that seem to affect, they're high enough temperature, they're effective, but then there's pyrolysis, gasification, supercritical water oxidation, hydrothermal liquefaction, a lot of emerging technologies there, and I'm curious if you guys are seeing that on this side of things too.
Yeah, there are a lot of emerging technologies to treat biosolids, and most of them do involve pretty extreme conditions like supercritical temperature and pressure. There are some, I talked a little bit about some technology being developed in Australia by the University of Queensland that I think is really cool, because what they're doing is they're taking biosolids that are generated at the treatment plant that contain PFAS in the liquid state before they're dewatered and then further processed or incinerated, and then using ion exchange resin that is enmeshed with magnetite to essentially extract PFAS from the biosolids, and then using magnetic properties of those little plastic beads to be able to remove them from the clean biosolids, and then using regeneration techniques that we've developed to be able, which use an alcohol and a brine to actually allow you to reuse those plastic beads over and over again. So it's a sustainable way of actually, if you haven't removed the PFAS upstream and it makes it into the biosolids at the treatment plant, there are technologies there at the bench scale net right now being ready to soon be deployed at the pilot scale and then full scale, but it's under development, right?
All right, do we have any more questions? All right, well, thank you very much. This was a really great audience participation. Very glad that this was interactive. It's really the first time we've talked about this at a biogas conference, and I think it's a really important thing that we continue to discuss. So in closing, PFAS is real. The regulatory landscape is evolving, and there are definitely still some gaps. But this industry has never been built on perfect conditions. It's been built by people who are willing to step into complexity and figure it out responsibly. The goal today was not to solve PFAS. It was to understand it better, to ask better questions, and to leave with more clarity than we walked in with. That's how we continue to move this industry forward. I want to thank all of our panelists, and thank you all for being part of the conversation.